One of the more misunderstood concepts when it comes to theology is this notion of fear of the Lord. So perhaps I'm suggest that in the minds of a lot of people, fear of the Lord is basically living in terror in the presence of God, or otherwise shaking in your boots in the presence of the Father, whereas the reality is actually quite different. And so Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI actually has a really good definition in this regard, when he says that fear of the Lord basically is exercising responsibility with regards to that portion of the world and that portion of human history which God has entrusted to me and not to another. And so again, fear of the Lord is basically exercising responsibility with regards to that portion of the world and that portion of human history which God has entrusted to me and not to another. Now, obviously, given the complexities of the modern world and the various problems that lie therein, this whole idea of exercising one's responsibility, again with regards to the world and human history, can seem intimidating at best. And so given all that, perhaps I may offer you a few suggestions as to how you might approach this issue, beginning perhaps with what you actually should not do. So first of all, perhaps I might suggest that when it comes to your own personal contribution to addressing the various evils of society, one thing you should not do is simply reduce your contribution to what's called virtue signaling. And so just to make sure we're on the same page, virtue signaling is basically naming an obvious wrong, which everyone knows to be wrong, because again, it's obvious. And perhaps I might suggest that, especially in the age of social media, it's really easy to engage in virtue signaling. And so, for example, maybe it consists of sharing a particular image on Instagram or simply hitting like on Facebook. But the whole idea is that even though those activities might be very good and noble in the sense of building awareness or fostering education, the point still remains that you simply cannot reduce your contribution to society to simply virtue signaling. Because in the reality of God's providence, you are called to do so much more. And more to the point, you are actually capable of so much more. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. But the second thing is this. When it comes to addressing the various evils of society, of which there are many, obviously, you simply cannot use violent means. And so again, when it comes to addressing the various evils of society, you simply cannot use violent means. Now, obviously, there's the reality of the just war theory, right? But we're not talking about that. We're talking about how to address systemic societal evils which exist on a local level. And so Pope Francis actually has a really good comment in this regard when he basically says that as a Christian people, the reason why we can't engage in violence is not simply because it's the wrong thing to do, even though that's obviously true. The reason why is because it basically undermines our message. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? So if our underlying message is love and respect and equality and the dignity of the human person, but we're engaging in various acts of violence, those acts ultimately undermine the message that we're trying to convey. Okay, so now that we've addressed a couple of things that we shouldn't do, it obviously begs the question, what exactly is it then that we actually should do? Well, perhaps I might suggest that first and foremost, we should take seriously our own personal conversion. And so again, first and foremost in a certain sense, we should take seriously our own personal conversion. You know, the former Archbishop of Philadelphia, actually, Charles Chaput, he spoke about this issue a couple of years ago when he said basically that when it comes to society, you always got to remember society is made up not so much of organizations or kind of abstract groups, but people. And not just groups of people, but individual people, which means that if you want to change society, you got to look to change the hearts and minds of individual people, again, beginning with yourself. And you see, practically speaking, what this means is that instead of simply thinking about evil in the abstract or looking at evil in the abstract, we should first of all look to ourselves and have the courage to ask ourselves the difficult questions. Where is there evil, corruption, wickedness, or selfishness in my own heart? And more to the point, am I willing to do whatever it takes to bring about the necessary changes, to bring about conversion in my life, to make reparation for my sins? Again, mindful of the fact that societal change begins with individual change. Again, beginning with myself, beginning with my own personal conversion. Okay, so that's sort of the first thing in terms of a concrete practical step, in terms of what one could do to kind of move the situation along. But perhaps I'm suggesting that a second thing a person could do is to look to become personally invested in terms of trying to bring about a solution to a societal wrong. And so again, look to become personally invested in terms of trying to bring about a solution to a societal wrong or a societal problem. And so Pope Francis, again, has a really great quote in this regard when he says that when it comes to the church, he prefers to have a church which is bruised and hurting and dirty, because it's basically been out there helping people on a local level, as opposed to a church which is sick because it's been built around a sense of security and self-confinement. And so to kind of give you a concrete example here, I remember hearing a story a couple of years ago about this Bible study group that was apparently meeting for a long period of time, when one of their members suddenly revealed that she was involved in prostitution. But what's interesting is that instead of simply condemning the evil of prostitution, the other members sort of banded together and they said, look, we will support you financially so you can get a new job and still support your family, right? So that's a very concrete example again of becoming personally invested in terms of bringing about a solution to a societal wrong. But that actually brings us to our next point, which is essentially this. When it comes to addressing various evils or injustices in society, we always have to keep in mind that it's never so much their problem or someone else's problem, but it is always in every case our problem, which is a very important concept to have in the back of your mind when it comes to actually generating solutions. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember a couple of years ago listening to a podcast by an American priest where he was giving a talk on some theological issue, but then his talk ended with a Q&A session, during which a member of the congregation apparently stood up and asked a rhetorical question with regards to some hot topic issue, something like euthanasia or abortion or whatever. And so basically the question or the statement was something like this. Father, given the seriousness of the issue, do you think that we are doing enough, like individually and collectively as a Christian people? And what he expected was that the priest would simply say, no, we're not doing enough, we should do more. But you see, what's interesting is that in responding to this particular question, the priest acknowledged that, yeah, perhaps we're not doing enough, individually and collectively, to deal with the matter at hand. But then he said, look, it never falls on any one individual to come up with a comprehensive solution to any sort of problem which afflicts society. But instead, we got to recognize that just as we bear collective responsibility for the various problems which are troubling this world, so too we must take a collective and collaborative approach to finding a solution to these problems. And so to give you a slightly more concrete example, I remember years ago talking to my former spiritual director about the whole process of conversion. And basically what he did was he gave me a working image of how to actually participate and collaborate with the grace of conversion, which I want to share with you now. And so basically what he said was that when you encounter someone who you perceive to be in need of conversion, rather than think of it in terms of bringing the person from -50 to +50, think of it like this. My job right now in the present moment is to collaborate with God's grace, the grace of conversion, a grace which precedes even my own presence and my own activity, to help the person in question move not so much from -50 to +50, but rather from -50 to -49 until the next moment, right? Or until the next person or circumstance comes along to help move the person farther along the path of conversion. And again, that's all I'm called to do. Anyways, even though we've been talking a lot today about what to do, practically speaking, to kind of move the situation forward, hopefully it goes without saying that everything we've been talking about today should be done in the context of prayer. And not just as an afterthought, right? But as a foundational principle. But if you think about it, this actually makes a lot of sense. Because if the root of these various problems facing society is ultimately a lack of personal conversion, and God himself is the author of conversion, well then finally we need to pray to the one to do the work which ultimately he alone can do. But you see, rather than leave us discouraged, this particular point about the primacy of God's role in bringing about the conversion of the world should actually give us tremendous hope and courage in facing these various problems we've been talking about today. Because no matter who we are, eventually we're going to have to come to grips with the inherent limitations of our finite nature. Eventually we're going to have to realize that these things we've been talking about today are completely beyond us. But again, rather than have that reality be a point of discouragement or despair, we can always come back to this idea that even though it's true that without the Lord we can do nothing, the corresponding truth is that with the Lord, all things are possible. But you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that all this presumes a deep sense of trust in the Lord. Trust at the point of a sort of reckless abandonment, if you will. Because even though it's true that our final victory in Christ is assured, the particular timing of God's providence and the particular means by which He will ultimately bring about this final victory are not necessarily what we might expect. So to illustrate the point and sort of end things off here, I'd like to use an example from the life of St. Augustine of Hippo. So as the story goes, before his conversion, St. Augustine had an opportunity to move from Carthage to the city of Rome to teach, but his mother Monica was fiercely opposed to the idea. And so, as you probably know, St. Monica had been praying very fervently for St. Augustine's conversion for a number of years. And her concern was that if he moved to Rome, which is known at the time for being very evil and wicked and corrupt, he would basically be lost to her forever. And so her prayer in the moment was that God would basically stop her son, again, from moving from Carthage to the city of Rome. But you see, what's interesting is that even though St. Augustine went on to move to the city of Rome, after his conversion, he reflected on this whole experience. And what he said was basically this: even though God denied his mother the prayer that she had made that day, again, to basically stop her son from moving from Carthage to Rome, God responded instead by answering the prayer that she had made every day, which of course was for the conversion of her son. Because what ultimately happened was that when St. Augustine moved to Rome, he met St. Ambrose, who ended up becoming the final catalyst in helping him come back to the Holy Catholic Church. And you see, perhaps I might suggest that this example from the life of St. Augustine might provide for us a really concrete and practical working image for us to draw upon as we labor for the conversion of the world, which is basically to say this: even though it's true that there might be times where God seems to be somewhat slow in terms of responding to the prayers that we make to him in the context of any given day, we got to continue to trust and believe that the one who has placed these deep desires in our hearts for justice, for freedom, for equality, and peace will eventually, in his own time and in his own way, answer the prayers of our deepest desires, these prayers that we implicitly make to him in the context of every single day. And may God bless you all.